We're also continuing to display the intellectual diversity of research on ethics in information organization. This was not meant to curate the last section together, but we do have two presentations on archives. This is, I am told, is information organization from a different perspective. So I happen to have been familiar with it a little bit when I worked at UBC, and so it was delighted to learn very much from it. So I'm looking forward to hearing those presentations. But first, we will start with Dean Seaman, metadata librarian at Memorial University of Newfoundland. The talk that he will be giving is Naming Names. Yes, the ethics of identification in digital library metadata. Dean Seaman has been a cataloging and metadata librarian at Memorial University in Newfoundland in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, since 2008. Previously, he held the position of cataloging librarian at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. He has a master's in theology, but don't let that fool you about into thinking that he gives him any divine insight into ethical problems. That's awesome. His research interests include automatic metadata creation, facial recognition technology, linked data, and now the ethics of organizing information. After a very foggy June in Newfoundland, he hopes to see the sun while he's visiting here in Milwaukee, and sure enough, gets what he asked for. Jane Chang is at the School of Library and Information Science at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Her talk, Archival Context, Digital Content, and the Ethics of Digital Archival Representation, is the first of the two archival presentations that we'll have this afternoon. She's an assistant professor in the School of Library and Information Science, as I said. She holds a PhD in Library and Information Science with an archival concentration from Simmons College in Boston, and a joint Master's of Archival Studies and Library and Information Studies from the University of British Columbia, Canada. She's a member of the ISCO Canada-US chapter. Her teaching and research areas include archival theory and practice, information organization and representation, electronic records management, digital curation, and digital archival representation. Before joining the faculty at Catholic University of America, she worked at Harvard University Archives and the University of Calgary Archives. And then finally, Anne J. Gilliland is from the Department of Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She will be giving a talk titled Contemplating Co-Creator Rights in Archival Description. Dr. Gilliland is a professor in the Department at UCLA and the UCLA Archival Studies Program and director of the Center for Information as Evidence at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is also the principal investigator for an IMLS-funded Building the Future of Archival Education and Research initiative. Her research is located in multiple national and international contexts and relates to digital records management, the design and evaluation of cultural information systems, metadata archaeology, social justice, and human rights issues as they relate to archives and records and archival education. She is a fellow of the Society of American Archivists. Now, before we get on with Dean, I just want to know whether Ewa has shown up. Okay, great, all right. So, without further ado then, Dean, please.
Right, thank you, and thanks to the committee for organizing this conference. It's given me an opportunity to explore an issue that's been kind of following me around for the last couple of years. Just a disclaimer, I'm a metadata practitioner, obviously, a cataloger, so I'm coming at it from more of the practical side. So what I want to talk about today are the ethical implications of adding identifying metadata or names to visual digital library objects. So I work at Memorial University of Newfoundland, and our main digital library is called the Digital Archive Initiative, or DAI. It contains over 150 different collections, 30,000 objects, and over 1.5 million items, if we include page images. And part of this great mass of objects, of course, is visual material, so photographs and videos. So the problem came about as I was working on a particular video collection, which is the Distance Education Learning and Teaching Support video collection, which has about 3,400 different videos. The scope of this particular video collection, it's videos from the 1960s through the 1990s, and most of these were produced by the university's extension service, which no longer exists, and it's a lot of videos going out into the community, engaging them on issues of importance to them, and also educating the community. And the community in this case means the provincial community, that is Newfoundland and door. There are also a lot of distance education videos, so a lot of taped lectures and other random stuff, FolkFest videos and test patterns, all kinds of things that were included in this collection. And I say there's a lot of random things because this collection started as a lot of videos were in storage in various parts of the campus in all types of formats. So there's very little information with these videos. So as it's still in process, we're going through the items and we're adding core metadata now to help decide what we want to keep in this collection. And the discussion usually focuses on who owns these rights or who created the object, and also the metadata of the mandate of the collection sponsor for videos we want to keep in the collection. So that's what the discussion usually focuses on for how this collection is going to end up looking. And as we're adding metadata, the focus is also very much on creator and publisher rights. But I'm also adding metadata that identifies people appearing in these objects, since that's one of the most, I think, semantically interesting aspects of visual objects and something that's most useful for our users. So as I'm going through these, I began to wonder, what about the rights of people appearing in these videos? How would they feel about their image being put online and their name attached to it? And when are their rights considered? So this paper focuses on that very issue. What is at stake and what are the ethical problems with putting people's images online in digital libraries and adding their names to the metadata? I'd like to first go back to a foundational question, and that is, what is the impact of putting an object online and adding metadata to it? So what happens when we put a visual object online? What's at stake? First of all, the item is published or it's made public. It's generally made accessible to anyone with internet access that it's put online. It's also interactive, and that is, the intended or presumed use of the object cannot be guessed or necessarily enforced. Charles S. uses two adjectives to describe a digital object online. It's global and it's greasy. Global in that it's accessible to anyone with internet access in the world, and greasy in that it can be used in ways the person who created or posted the image can't entirely control. So a good example of this is Chang v. Virgin Mobile USA. And picture here is Allison Chang. And this photograph was taken at a youth group car wash in the United States by her youth group leader, Justin Wong. And Justin Wong later put the photographs from this car wash onto Flickr and gave it a Creative Commons license indicating that it could be used commercially as long as he was given credit as a photographer. So it was picked up by a commercial body, Virgin Mobile, and used in their ad campaign in Australia. So Allison Chang found out about this and decided that she was going to sue Virgin Mobile. And although her case against Virgin Mobile was unsuccessful due to lack of jurisdiction, it highlights the greasy nature of online digital objects, where the photo was put online for a particular reason, to document the social event, and used in an entirely different way by a commercial body. So in this example, Allison Chang had no control over her image's use. The conversation regarding the use of the object was between the photographer and the commercial entity. What this indicates is that control over your image can be lacking once it has been put online. In other words, it's greasy. This lack of control is problematic for the person appearing in visual objects because control over your personal information is at the very core of personal privacy. By putting an object online, we're taking the decision away from an individual of what information gets out there about them, and we're eroding the control an individual has over their online identity. It adds more data in the form of images to the pile of information already online about a person, and changes that person's online identity as a result. What it fails to do, however, is to make that image easily findable or accessible on the internet, and that is, of course, the function of metadata. So current search engines, of course, depend on textual description for retrieval, most of them at least. Textual objects like documents or websites have at least the possibility of being found through full text, even if they don't have a metadata record. Visual objects, on the other hand, need that textual surrogate to be found, except if you were to browse through them, which of course is a lot less efficient. For visual objects, then, metadata gives voice to the object, it enables and restricts the semantic journey of the content, and it becomes the idiom of exchange and communication. In searching for visual objects, therefore, the shadow, that is metadata, overtakes the object that casts it. So metadata clearly is vital to an object being found, and among the metadata elements to include for visual objects is the identification of people appearing in the material. The metadata practitioner becomes responsible for the powerful action of making the link between a textual identifier, their name, and an object, in this case their image. They simultaneously make an object findable or accessible by who appears in it, and take an individual's control over their personal information or their privacy away from them. So the metadata practitioner is globally exposing the link between someone's name and image and changing the person's online identity. This act is a violation of privacy in that we're taking control away from people appearing in the object. The true impact of adding metadata and identifying people within them, then, is the very findability of digital resources and the privacy of people appearing in them. So those are the stakes of putting objects online and adding metadata, but what will inform our discussion of the ethics of this impact? So to try to answer that, I looked at some of the literature related to ethics from various fields: information science, information technology, journalism, ethics of academic research, and also looked at some of the legal literature. So a few major ethical themes were apparent from the literature that can help inform our discussion of the issue at hand. A particular definition of ethics I came across is guidelines to influence social behavior to protect the rights of individuals. And this is the thrust of the first ethical consideration: protecting the rights of individuals versus enabling society's right to access information. As we've seen, the stakes are high. We are putting at risk someone's control over their personal information in order to make it accessible to the wider world. Information science ethical codes tell us to place the needs of clients above other concerns, but also be sensitive and responsive to social responsibilities appropriate to the profession. So we want to provide access points in our metadata records so people can find resources and society as a whole can benefit. But we also don't want to violate someone's privacy, defined as control over personal information. Journalism, of course, deals with this all the time. They publish information about people and images of people. And in order to justify this act of making public, they call in established rights, such as the freedom of expression. But only insofar as it doesn't violate someone's reasonable expectation of privacy. And even this can be violated, however, as there is legal precedent to publish private facts if the facts are deemed to have social value. That is, if they can be proven to benefit society. One of the other fundamental ethical questions is whether the object depicts people in the public or private sphere. And generally speaking, legally at least, if an image is captured in public sphere, it's allowed to be published. So that can have some bearing on which objects we decide to keep online. Nissenbaum insists that registering public information is morally important, and others note that if a photo or other visual object has no expectation of privacy, no invasion of privacy is possible. Now, the courts only protect privacy of information if the information is inherently private. On the flip side, we need to be aware of private situations and correlative expectations of privacy. If the image was captured in situations in which one can legitimately expect privacy, they should be able to control information about their behavior in those private spaces. And here then we're left to question the object, to probe it for whether it was captured in a private environment, which leads to possibly treat the object and its information as private, meaning taking the object offline, or whether it was captured in a public environment, which allows to treat the object and statements about it or its metadata as public information. A further consideration is whether, as technology changes, people's expectation of privacy also changes. Possibly their definitions of what is in the public sphere versus the private sphere, and definitely in terms of how much control people insist on having or expect over their personal information. In the words of Sun Microsystems co-founder Scott McNealy, "You have no privacy, get over it." Another ethical consideration is the role of the metadata practitioner. One of our professional ethical duties as people who describe things and resources is to authentically represent resources, or to respect the object and represent it as truthfully as we can, what Brody calls fair representation. So this is what we are adding, fair representation. This ideal, of course, pulls against more general ethical concerns that we're eroding people's personal informational privacy. By adding identifying metadata, we satisfy the rights of our users or society at the expense of individuals. And this is what we are taking away, informational privacy. So I really want to be neutral in this act, I really do, but I'm clearly not. If we take seriously our responsibility to act professionally and represent the object fairly, we are possibly violating the rights of individuals. Truthful representation of an object has consequences whether we like it or not. Another ethical consideration is trying to protect people from harm, so this includes generally treating people with respect. It's also protecting the vulnerable, which in itself may be difficult to gauge. We are responsible for protecting those who may not be able to protect themselves. In other words, increased vulnerability requires increased responsibility. And I guess as metadata practitioners and human beings, which most of us are. And we also need to keep in mind that we are working with communities as we collect data and publicize it. Adding metadata, we need to be sensitive to the possible concerns of individuals and groups of people, and be prepared not to proceed if it could jeopardize our relationship with that community. Related to this protection from harm principle is trying to define what harm is. So in our particular case, at the point of adding metadata, we don't necessarily know how people feel about their object being put online and then being identified with it. We don't know if they'll be pleased, elated, indifferent, embarrassed, outraged, or worst case, litigious. In addition to that, even if consent was given at the time to make the object somewhat public, could the people appearing these objects, especially if it's over 20 years old, have known that it would eventually be made globally accessible at the click of a mouse when it was put online? To add another layer of complexity, views on fair treatment of individuals and entire conceptions of privacy can be different from culture to culture. So we're often left trying to guess what the person appearing might consider harmful and have to hope that we guess correctly. In other words, consent is often unknowable. So what we're left with then is trying to take into account the ethical issues of the individual versus society, public versus private, the professional ethic to authentically represent items, and to do our best to protect people from harm. So next I'm going to discuss how we may practically choose to apply these ethical themes. And I want to make clear that this isn't really a prescriptive ethic, but gives us a few questions to ask as we sit down, as I would sit down to describe visual objects, trying to make the decision of whether they should be online and identifying metadata added. And although this paper's concentration is the identification of people and visual objects, when we discuss practicalities, the practical move will generally be to take an object offline completely if there's an ethical problem with naming someone who appears in it, as opposed to just not identifying somebody in the metadata. For although naming and metadata is essential to a visual object's findability, the image of someone forms part of their identity and needs to be taken down if problematic. So with those things in mind, the first question I'd ask is, what was the context at the point of capture? Was it in a private setting or a public setting? And this could affect, not necessarily definitively, the decision to put an object online and identify people in it. Also, if it could be ascertained easily, what would the expectation for dissemination be? That this would have been put out widely in public or just to a particular audience, or that it would not have been disseminated at all. Our transmitter programs that are part of this video collection are a good example of this. And so pictured here are screenshots from some of the videos from our transmitter programs, and these were the extension service going out into the community, setting up a very small transmitter and broadcasting to the immediate community within a few kilometers. So they would fill that airtime. They go for a weekend usually with talking about community issues, interviewing people, bringing people into the studio for call-in shows, and these people down here just came in to sing Beat It, just because they could, and they lived down the street. So I guess we would have to question. They obviously expected this just to be broadcast to their particular community, so at this point we would have to question, well, should we actually put this online and make it publicly available? All right. So the next question relates closely to the general ethical tenet to protect people from harm. Is someone in the video we might term a vulnerable state? And if they are, the responsibility shifts to us to act on whether the object should be taken down completely. So a good example is children, of course, and here we have another screenshot from a transmitter program of kids doing the hokey pokey. And I think that's what it's all about. I think it's at that stage. So I guess, this was videotaped within a classroom. It's a 5-minute long video, no kidding, of just doing the hokey pokey. And so we have to wonder, well, A, what value does it bring to a digital collection? So we probably take it down on that grounds. But another part of it is, this was kind of a private situation. It's in a classroom that's being videotaped in a classroom. But it's also a public situation that's being broadcast publicly, even though it's just a few kilometer range. So, is this something that we might want to consider taking down? Should all videos with children be taken down? Or is it okay if it's out on the street and you have to catch some children in the background? Is it okay to put that online if it's kind of incidental children? So all these questions have to be asked. And another example is patients. So we also have medical training videos that include patients, and those are immediately taken down since they're clearly one of the most vulnerable states that you could imagine. So they also need to be protected. So the next question I'd ask is, what type of appearance people make of the object just as it relates to what can this tell us how the person may have viewed this item being made public. If it's a performance or a formal interview with a broadcaster, let's say, chances are the expectations that the person appearing in it would have expected to be made public in some way. If the appearance is more candid, putting it online may be a cause for concern. So these are a few practical questions to ask, but it should be clear that the context of each visual object needs to be taken into account, keeping in mind the impact of putting objects online and adding metadata, and the ethical considerations already discussed. So finally, from the practical point of view, there are a few things I want to emphasize. First is that we have to try to hold in balance the rights of the individual in not putting objects up and naming people if we believe it's ethically dubious, but we also need to remember that there is another obligation to society and our community to provide these materials for research and not prevent them from being published unnecessarily. Partly because, practically, if we were to perform rights clearance and get individual consent from everybody appearing in these visual objects or their estates, we'd be severely restricted in putting visual objects online. To be exhaustive in this task is very difficult, if not impossible. So we should try not to timidly exclude everything. Partnered with this boldness, we should liberally take objects down when people object to them, particularly people appearing. There's a need to keep in mind that continued good relations with the community is essential to the work of most digital libraries. And in this action, the power is given back to people appearing in objects to regain control over their online identity. So in conclusion, naming names has a tremendous impact on a person's privacy and must be considered over to gain society's right to access the material and a metadata practitioner's right to describe it truthfully. The ethical stakes are high, but ethical practice is possible by holding these ethical values in tension. Thank you.